אחר צהריים טובים לכל האמיצים והאמיצות שנשארו, ותודה על היום הזה שהיה מעורר השראה, הוא היה מרתק. אני חושבת שיש פה כמה אנשים שאמרו לי, אני לא מספיקה לכתוב את כל מה שעובר לי בראש במסגרת כל מה שאני שומעת היום. אז זה היה לעונג, באמת. תודה לשלושתכן ולכל ההנהלה של האיגוד. אני אתחיל את המפגש הזה, אני אשאל שאלה אחת או שתיים ואנחנו נעבור לשאלות שלכם, כי אני מניחה שיש רבים פה שיש להם, רגע, פלאש, close your eyes, that's the moment. ואחר כך אנחנו נמשיך הלאה, ואני רוצה להתחיל עם קטע קצר מתוך טקסט שנקרא בעייתם של המוזאונים. אינני אוהב את המוזאונים יתר על המידה, רבים מהם נהדרים, אף אחד אינו מענג. לרעיונות של סיווג, שימור ותועלת ציבורית שהם מובנים וראויים, אין כמעט קשר לתענוגות. כבר בפסיעה הראשונה שלי לעברם של הדברים היפים, יד נוטלת ממני את המקל, כיתוב אסר עליי לעשן, משותק מן המחווה הסמכותית ותחושת האילוץ, אני נכנס לאולם הפיסול, שבלבול לא נעים שולט בו. טורסו מסנבר ניצב בין רגלי אתלט מברונזה, הרוגע והאלימות, ההבלים, החיוכים, ההתכווצויות והאיזונים הביקורתיים ביותר, יוצרים בעיניי רושם בלתי נסבל. אני נתון בתוך מהומה של יצורים קפואים, שכל אחד מהם תובע מבלי להשיג את קיומם של כל היתר. אנחנו קופצים אל הסוף, כי אין לנו זמן לקרוא את הכל, למרות ששווה. תכף אני אגיד מה זה. ראשי כבד עליי, רגליי כושלות, בצאתי ממקדש התענוגות. העייפות הקיצונית מלווה לפעמים בפעילות כמעט כואבת של הרוח. הכאוס המופלא של המוזאון הולך בעקבותיי ומשתלב בתנועות הרחוב החי. המועקה שלי מחפשת סיבה. היא שמה לב, או שהיא ממציאה. אינני יודע איזה יחסים מתקיימים בין הבלבול שמטריד את מנוחתה, לבין המצב המסובך של האומנויות בזמננו. ואת הטקסט הזה כותב פול ולרי, והוא כותב אותו ב-1923. וכבר אז הוא מזהה את הבעיות של המוזאונים. So, going from the past to the present and maybe to the future. Usually when we talk about the future, we talk about the present because this is what we can understand, realize and imagine. Yeah. And I think when we look at the future of museums and the digital scene or world, we are talking about fear with anticipation altogether. And I was wondering, how do you see the future of these two merging together in between fear and anticipation? Who wants to start? Chris is tired. You can start.
Jake, keep talking.
Yeah, I can start.
I did two in a row.
That's okay. I mean, I think there is certainly a lot to fear if you're not anticipating. But I think Chris's point that if your museum has a good overall strategy, the digital strategy will follow suit. And I think one thing that certainly we try and focus on in our work is to understand what's special about a museum. And part of that is just about physical space itself. There's lots of well-earned critiques around phones, that they are omnipresent, but they're also two or arguably one-dimensional. And that the things that you do in a phone are supposedly social media with other people, but in reality it's you in a cold piece of glass staring at each other for, frankly, the majority of most people's waking hours, right? That means that museums have an incredible opportunity because you can go there, put your phone away and talk to your friend, talk to your mother, talk to your child. There's a reason, I think, why people line up to get an extra device instead of putting a new app on their phone. Because on some degree, people go to museums to avoid their phones. It's an excuse to put your phone away, to have a conversation. One of the best museum tricks, I'm sure anyone who's run anything with the children's department knows, you can have an exhibit about an artwork or about a children's author, just put out cushions and books. And it's packed. Parents are reading to their children. And you look at it and you think, that's so silly. Why would a parent read to their kid? They probably do that every night. But they do it in a special way because they're in the museum around these artworks. It's a special moment to have these human connections. And technology is, sucking people's attention all the time. But if you leverage what's special about a museum, we have these incredible artifacts. And most of all, the commitment from visitors to explore an idea in physical space socially, if you leverage that through technology, not a screen, as Chris was saying yesterday, a screen next to an object that's going to be competing with it, but instead, whether it's a screen or not, hopefully not, but some type of an experience that amplifies that object, that makes you want to look at that object again, that makes you understand the richness of that object, well then suddenly it's a multi-dimensional experience, and the social is the glue that put that together.
I think we're at a very interesting moment in the last 18 months where actually the anticipation that particularly mobile and the world of screens that we live in is turning in one way or another into a world more driven by fear about it. A lot of us wake up now in the morning waiting to see what an American president puts his thumb to type into his screen, that then goes out into the world and changes materially the world that billions of us live in together. And that's happened because we've gone for a world where suddenly what all this meant was potential and hope to now realizing it means real things and changes the world in real ways. Yep. And that's a new thing. But I think as much as anything else, if we look at the future of what museums have, actually we can look at the brilliance of things in the present and look to their potential to being spread more widely. You know, for the second time today, I'll use a quote from the great science fiction novelist William Gibson, who said, "The future's already here, it's just unevenly distributed." And, you know, look at the amazing projects Jake has been doing. You know, look at the things that have happened at the Cooper Hewitt in the last 2 years from nearly a decade's worth of work that went to that. Think ahead to the world in 10, 15, 20 years' time, where these things have gone more through museums. They don't just exist in great museums sitting on the side of Central Park. They exist through museums, as I was saying earlier, all across the world in different countries, small museums, big museums. That's the hope that we have to take in this, that the lessons some museums are able to learn now because of particular scale, particular things about their collections, particular brilliant museum directions in small places like Aarhus, where part of my family comes from, can spread more through the museum text and have that positive effect back to society that can bring. So we're not just worrying about crazy presidents doing crazy things on their phones. We're worrying and believing that museums can and what they do, what they should do, which is to change societies for the better.
עברית או אנגלית? Okay. So I'm going to agree with Jake. The essence, I think, is the social part. I'm going to disagree with any of the concerns having to do with screens. Screens are not technology. Screens are just one particular instance at this particular point in time that really matters very little. If you're going to ask about whether it's anticipation or fear and think about the future, in addition to the Gibson quote about prediction, there's also this quote about prediction in the short term is usually an overstatement or an overestimation of what's going to happen, while predictions for the longer term are underestimations and they miss the mark by thinking about too little. This business about focusing on screens in critiquing technology rather than thinking about social, the interaction, the conversation between children and their parents, among visitors of the museum, conversations that take place before, during, and after the visit. That is what is the essence. Borges has this story about this person who makes a wonderful image map of the world on a one-to-one scale, where in the end, when the project is completed, he has this really meticulous, wonderful museum of the world, which is another world. And what I think we can draw from this story, this fable, and the thinking about making museums is that it's, and this is something that we're going to pick a fight about, it's not the artifact. It's the fight about the artifact. It's the conversation that will take place. And therefore it's not the screen, nor is it the keyboard, nor is it where your thumbs or a president happens to have their thumbs. It's the actual conversation. And if in the end a politician tweets and raises a conversation, as much as I dislike that politician, that particular politician and his politics, I prefer that to the politician who doesn't converse, with whom there is no interaction. My doctoral dissertation many, many eons ago was about interaction. This was long before there were screens to complain about. And now, screens happen to be the thing that we're thinking about, but it's also earphones, and it's also touch things, and it's coming up pretty closely appeals to other senses, taste and smell and tactile and so forth. And I'd rather we not focus either in our fears or in our anticipations on the particular characteristics of a particular medium, but rather think about where we're going. And I'd like to propose that we're underestimating where we can still go. With all the fascinating things we've seen at the National Gallery, the British Museum, the beautiful things you're doing in museums, we're only making the very first steps. It's not this clear LCD screen or that sound thing. It is things that appeal to all 5 or more senses that we're going to be describing, and through those, most importantly, extending the conversation and interaction.
And to the object question. Okay. Well, I think most of us here are curators, and I think some of us are still thinking about the place of the object in the future. Is it going to be replaced? Is it going to be out of the museum? Is the dialogue going to be the center of this experience in the museum, or are we going to give away all those objects that we love so much and appreciate and cherish?
So, especially because we both do architecture and media together, we get this question all the time. And I am always the first person, typically I even say it in the lectures, like there's nothing that's going to age faster than hardware. Right? So that you just put that on the table, you say that it's obsolete the second you put it in. If you focus on the story, on the emotion, on the interaction, on the meaning, then as the hardware ages, like you have that great story about that flap that's still there 20 years ago. I went to the Air and Space Museum, which is the most attended museum in all of America, and there's this incredibly grainy video of Neil Armstrong on the moon, and I'm looking at it, it's very famous footage, and I'm like, man, this looks like really even more grainy than I remembered. And I looked up, and I swear to you, it was the exact same 3 Canon red, blue, and green projector that I had seen when I was 5. And that's why it looked so bad. And yet, everyone was crowded around like, oh my gosh, that's a person on the moon, right? I think in terms of the question about objects versus screens, and I do really in particular mean screens, I think that another sort of luminary you might quote is Marshall McLuhan, who talks about the medium being the message, right? If you look at an artifact, if you look at a historic artifact or a work of art, what does it say to you before you even read it, before you even know what it is? It says, this is important, this is old, this is worth your attention, and this is worth retention from past generations to future generations. And that is an incredibly important message, whether you're history, whether you're an art museum, whether you're a science museum, etc. That is what, in my mind, makes museums particularly vital at this moment, where you have this almost sustained digital amnesia because of the incredible flow of information that's at our fingertips, and really the disposable nature of information as you Google it and forget it. Right? Human nature is being changed, the memory is being changed by our relationship with the internet. So the artifact, to me, is so incredibly important. On the other hand, I think there is something very, very tangible about the ways in which our new, democratized, everyone has a screen in their pocket, present and future, has really changed our relationship to societies, to each other. It makes us scream for attention. It makes us more combative. It polarizes things. There's no coincidence that, like, wow, Israel is more polarized than ever before, and we have Brexit, and we have, neo-Nazi far-rightists in Germany, and we have Trump. Like, this is not a coincidence. It's not to say that the internet caused that, but there is a direct relationship between the medium and the message. In the same way that you had a command and control broadcast model for television, right? You now have a new sort of completely distributed Wild West of information with lots of fake news bubbling up. And the thing that I would observe is people figured that out with TV. They were like, oh my gosh, these kids are sitting here slack-jawed for hours at a time every day. We need to invent Sesame Street. We need to invent PBS. We need to make heritage live on these platforms in a way that makes sense, that makes meaning out of this new medium. And I think people like Chris and arguably me and other people and all of us have that goal, that aim, that aspiration to use technology for the better ends that it affords, specifically so that it is something good for the future.
I mean, I'd use the example of actually a particular object to show the ongoing challenge of what that means. If I used the example earlier of these hand axes that they have at the British Museum, the oldest artifact the human race has ever created, about 2 million years old. They're not only held at the British Museum. They're held at museums across the world. And actually, if you look, you can buy them on eBay for about $25 each. So these are objects. There's thousands of them have been discovered that you as a person could quite easily buy tomorrow. But the museum remains the only place where they will be put in a context that asks you to stop and look and think and consider their meaning. And whilst the museum holds that social role, which it still does, and however it chooses to present them, whether that's through, just the power of light, the things that we can do with sound, the written word, technology as a means of intermediation, while museums fundamentally can hold that role, and society can think that that still means something, to go and stop and look and think, then I have no worries about the role of the objects in the museums of the future. And I don't think social media has taken that away yet. But we have to continue to work at that rift.
So I guess it's left up to me to take the extreme position. I'll stand up to the challenge. I don't like museum gift shops. But there's one thing that I bought at the British Museum gift shop. In fact, two things that I bought at the British Museum gift shop and I have displayed proudly in my office. It's a piece of cloth with a replica of, and also an actual physical replica of, the Rosetta Stone, both displayed in the British Museum. And one of the things I sort of made a beeline to go see, because they stand for a very important message for me. And so I have copies of the Rosetta Stone, two in my office that I bought at the British Museum gift shop. And this brings me to an anecdote, a little story, that is my response to the question of what is the importance of objects and artifacts. Across the street here, they are now working very diligently on rebuilding the Israeli National Library. Right before they broke ground, they had a think group put together with the charter of deciding about the allocation of funds. Obviously, there's a lot of money being put into it, and very generally speaking, there were three different purposes for that money. One was cement and marble, the building. The second was more books. And the third was digitizing. So that's a distillation of the question of the object. Building, books, or digital. And because they knew my opinion then also, they brought me in to be the advocate for the digitizing. Less cement and marble, fewer actual physical books, and more digitizing. Now, it's a library, it's not a museum, it's a little bit different, but still, I was in a minority there as well, with clearly many of the donors wanting to have a big building, and clearly many of the traditional aficionados of libraries wanting to have actual books, and you already know my opinion about books. And some of these crazy, wild-eyed people coming from the digital suggesting that the object is over and what you need is to digitize everything so that people can make use of resources from anywhere in the world, any time of day, any day of the year, and so forth. And I thought of how I would present my opinion there. And what I said was, let's do a Gedanken experiment, a thought experiment. Let's suppose somewhere someone stumbles, like in the Rosetta Stone story, someone stumbles on Moses' tablets. The first set was broken and disappeared, but there's a second set somewhere with the 10 Commandments. What should happen to those tablets? Where should they be placed? My point was that definitely they shouldn't be in the library, but I don't even think that they should be back on this side of the street in Heichal Sefer, in the Shrine of the Book. Pardon? Yeah. What I think should be done actually has been done, and that is to take those 10 Commandments and make them available and known and embraced worldwide. Much more than the objects. That's my answer to the question.
Okay. Before I'll go to my last question. Any questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm Kobe. I'm a game designer.
I think we can hear you.
I'm not a curator.
We'll repeat your question. Go ahead.
Yep.
So I followed Shizaf's lecture, and the motif was connected on the threads from the different angles of digitalizing world, and the death of memory, the death of place, the death of time. And I think another, if I can add another death to your list, is the death of patience, or maybe on the flip side, the death of boredom. Because people today are not the same way they were 10 or 12 years ago, because they have their mobile phones all the time. And even here, we were saying children, they can't get bored anymore because they have these devices all the time. But even here, I sent them 12 work emails during the lecture, and I was busy all the time. And I was still paying attention to the lecture, but in the very small spaces in between, I couldn't let myself get bored. I did stuff. And it kind of reflects on me as a child. I was too bright for my own good, and I got bored really, really fast. So gaming kind of attracted me. And eventually, after many reincarnations of my career, I became a game designer, and now I'm here listening to you guys for these wonderful ideas. It took me to Chris and Jake's presentation. And I think what you do here is trying to take the boredom out of the museum, because for a regular person just walking through the exhibition, there's a very segmented small crowd that will actually enjoy it, but a variety of people, or even maybe children that go into the museum, or people that aren't particularly loving art, but they say, hey, that's the museum. You need to minimize boredom and make the experience as engaging as possible. And for me, gaming is the most pure form of that, but it doesn't have to be an actual game. It could be something in between. Definitely not the classic experience of looking at exhibitions. So there has to be something in between. So more of an anecdote than question, but
Maybe I should apply some English sarcasm to this, which is maybe what we should be trying to do is bore people in new ways. That's fine. One thing I would say is that human beings are obsessed with the death of things. Death of Western civilization is a brilliant topic at the moment. We're always thinking everything's dying, it's all going to end. The truth of human history, which museums capture and tell very well, is actually very few things die, they change. And what we are seeing now is change, I would say, in many things, rather than the death of them. Reading, I worked in book publishing. We thought that publishing was going to die 10 years ago, and it hasn't died. It's changed. It's diversified, actually, and it's actually evolved probably as a stronger thing than it was before, because we got rid of the things we needed to stop doing that really weren't sustainable types of publishing, and narrowed our focus to become better at the things we do. And ebooks became a new category of publishing, which has enabled certain types of fiction writing particularly to be stronger than they've ever been before. Game of Thrones probably wouldn't be as popular as it is on TV if fantasy books didn't translate so well to reading on a Kindle. And these things go together to create new social circumstances in ways that we can't quite grasp as they're happening, but they happen. And so I would say think more about change than death.
Well, of course, death is a rhetorical device, not an actual prediction, but things do die, and things do change. Theater hasn't died with the arrival of cinema, but it certainly has changed. On the other hand, the fountain pen is close to dead.
That's good. And a terrible invention.
And the ballpoint pen made it go away. Some things do disappear, and the death, of course, is a rhetorical device. But I think your point has to do with the issue of spans of attention that are shortening, and ADHD, either real or imagined or used as an excuse. Most importantly, I think most interestingly for museum curators and designers, is this business of multitasking. I wish I had the time to go into depth, but let me just say multitasking has gotten a really bad rap. It's used by many people as a 4-letter word, even though we need many more than 4 letters. While at the same time, multitasking is, for many of us, the quintessential sign of expertise. It's the four-handed pianist playing virtuoso music, multitasking. It's the kid who has several windows open at the same time. It's the juggler who does things that we all envy. And the span of attention, ADHD business, is the flip side of virtuosity. And I think I made an allusion to TLDR in my talk. Yeah.
I mean, I guess I would look at it from another angle, particularly, as an American coming to a city like Jerusalem. If there's any city to hold a conference like this about the merits of things that endure, it's Jerusalem, right? I mean, went to the Tower of David, and I was sending all these pictures to my wife and my family, and I was like, man, makes the comparative amount of peace that I've experienced in my lifetime seem, frankly, singular, versus all the incredible ravages over centuries and millennia here in Jerusalem. And I think museums, again, the medium is the message. If you put something out that has endured all the way back to 2 million years, you're saying something about heritage, and you're saying something about the human expression and capacity for human expression. Whether you look at social media on screens, etc., that medium is designed and enforces that the content is disposable. And there's something, I think, laudable about the Museum of the Bible trying to gather a small kernel of attention based on new trends from Wonder Woman and food. But that's a very different approach than trying to get people to actually focus on something that is a human truth or asset or value or expression that has endured for generations and generations. And there's something incredibly powerful to a work of art or a work of heritage that has lasted for more than 140 characters in a second. So as the popular media attention span gets shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter, I think it again puts more onus on museums to create engagement around these objects that have endured. And I frankly think that, whether it is intellectuals, aesthetes, parents with children, intergenerational vacationers, people who are in new places that are curious. There are big swaths of audiences that are hungry to have those experiences, right? You can hire actors to smile at them as they go in and they'll have a better time, but they're there, they want to come. You can jump out into social media to capture their attention and to remind them these things exist and you can go here and you can have a fun experience. But once they're there, the onus is on all of us to capture, to bottle, to compress, or to communicate the passion that curators, that historians, that all of us have for these objects, and to express them so that, as my son experienced, like we went to a museum and I was like, Dexter, he's 9, I was like, this is cuneiform. And he was like, yeah, it's just like clay with markings. And I was like, no. This is the first time any human wrote anything. Anything. Humans invented writing. It didn't exist until someone pressed these little tools in here. It was based on economics, it was based on trade, but everything you enjoy today was predicated on that little blob of clay, right? And it shouldn't be on me as an informed parent to have to do that work, right? It's a case and it's filled with these amazing artifacts, but nobody would know because the museum had a little label next to it, and that's it. And so every single museum, I would hope, with all of our passions, is there to grab the visitor by the hand and say, no, look at this. This is really, really important. Herod built this. Look how big these stones are. Do you know how hard it is? You imagine what it was like to actually fashion timber and rope and understand how to move these things 2,000 years ago? Humans have this horrible flaw. We look at everything as a foregone conclusion. You walk around Jerusalem, or you walk around Manhattan, for example, you're like, oh, sure, Manhattan, sure, why not? And then you go back and you look at it, it's frankly the stupidest place to put a metropolis. It's an island. You can't even get to it. Why is it there? It makes no sense. It makes absolutely no sense that you would build the tallest skyscrapers in the entire 20th century there. But if you rewind the tape and you play it forward, all of these individual little choices from a bunch of little Dutch explorers and traders who frankly went to Brooklyn first and then this other island, and then we're like, Manhattan's a little less swampy and I'm too tired to move a 4th time. And then you get Manhattan, right? But humans just take that as a foregone conclusion. You're like, oh yeah, tallest tower, sure. Oh yeah, I don't know, some old rubble walls. It's like, no. Do you know what this means? Do you know who built this and why they built this and the conflicts and the blood that was shed here and what that means for us today and for tomorrow?
That to me is what museums have the capacity to do. It's just a matter of the communication.
Yeah, that turns it back to us, the curators,
Exactly.
to tell the good story. Another important question?
Thank you.
That's for you. One last question, I think. One, two, maybe? Yes, go.
It's not a question, it's more a comment. Please. What? Questions. Questions? And maybe what I'll say will be a question at the end. I must say that I'm very, very impressed, really, from what I saw today. But on the other hand, I'm very worried about what I saw. Because I go back to the 40s when Walter Benjamin wrote his book about the aura of the original, and I'm very worried about what he wrote at his time and when we are now. I'm saying that I'm impressed from all the ideas and the achievement that we saw today, even in the Israeli cases, and of course what we saw from your projects. But I'm still asking, where is the original? Do we need to go to the museum really to see, especially to you, Jack, all the amazing things that I was so impressed, and I was trying to write a little bit about them. But maybe we can go to enjoy it or to learn it and to engage it and to be emotional. Not in a museum. You don't need maybe a museum anymore, although it's fantastic. So I'm going back to the real essence. Maybe you would say that I'm old-fashioned and I'm passé, as my students told me when I still had the Nokia blue telephone, and they looked at me and they said, "Shelly, you are a dinosaur." And I said, what can I do? I mean, I'm not at the 20th century, and this is really my complex in a way. I don't really know yet how to eat it.
So
And just to mention two more words. The original, the important word which is hyper-reality, that Umberto Eco wrote about it, and the word simulacra. And the word simulacra meant what we see without the original. And I think that what you are doing in a way is...
So I completely share both your anxieties and some of your conclusions. I also, both myself and certainly for my kids, have very old cell phones. I'm on board with lots of ways in which you want to focus attention on the original artwork itself or the original object. To me, I think the key is, in this moment in particular, in terms of the boredom, in terms of the competition for people's attention, the job of the museum is to harness the expertise and passion of the storytellers to make it vital, to make it engaging, and to make these objects important enough that you know why they're in the cases. And I think the key to that is to use technology where it exists or where it's helpful in order to draw attention to that object. And that's why I brought forward this suggestion or notion that art, as we imagine it, happens between you and the artwork itself. The artwork itself can be in storage, but when you get the physical artifact in front of you, you're like, wow, I get a moment with this artwork if you care about the artwork. But all you need to do is go to any museum, including this one, and watch visitor behavior, and works that are unknown, works that are exhibited in a way that people are meant to walk by them, works that are uninterpreted, get no attention whatsoever. And it's easy to say they're art because they're hanging here, but it's also, you could argue, that they're not artworks because people aren't paying attention to them. They're not even looking at them. I think to me, the real threshold was your example about the library, which I completely concur. For libraries, if you look at a book as a collection of characters that make words, that make sentences, that transmit ideas, by all means, digitize them, stream them, listen to them while you're on the track, etc. That's not what an artwork is. An artwork is being in the presence of something that was physically fashioned by another human being. And that physical presence And in particularly when that physical presence is cemented by the architecture, by the institution, and by the relationship you have with the people that you share, and being able to listen to a curator or hear from a historian, that's way more than you can ever get from any simulacrum. So yeah, the digital is really important, but it's different for a library, because a library is there to provide access to information. Museum is there to provide the presence, in my mind, of human achievement, or human expression, or human investigation, or curiosity. And that, I think, you need human presence for. So as long, I think, as you hold on to that, and as long as you don't just judge, well, I have an artifact in a case, I've done my job, but instead think to yourself, how do we make that artifact important enough that people will stop, put their phones down, and pay attention and have a conversation about it? That, to me, is a much higher and more important standard. Sometimes, frankly, it takes fewer artifacts. Sometimes it takes more attention to a film or a piece of footage or tours or things that you can touch or things that you can smell or things that you can hold using all of your five senses. But museums have not, taken the materials and the special superpowers that they have as institutions to beat back all of the ways in which media is gathering their attention. No smartphone's going to give you five senses. No smartphone's going to give you time with your kids. No smartphone is going to give you an interesting date and a point of conversation or a deeper memory. Studies have shown that smartphones, because they're a scroll, because they're always accessible, specifically don't write memories. Museums are the opposite. It's hard to get there. It's a pain. You have to go there, tickets. But then you're in front of the Rosetta Stone. And when your 5-year-old's like, why is this important? You say, no, look at this. This was it. This is how humans actually figured out the relationship between these three languages. This is it. And suddenly you're like, whoa, that's amazing. Or if you put it in the context of these 100 objects that define human civilization, that's amazing. These are things that museums are uniquely qualified to do. So to me, that's what the objects are really good for.
You didn't answer the question about the original.
What's that?
I think you did.
No, but I mean, okay, so in terms of the original, being in front of that Rosetta Stone is qualitatively different than seeing it in a scroll on social media or even watching a video on YouTube. Those, to me, are awesome ways to convey in a parallel medium maybe similar messages. But, I would argue, it's actually very hard to get that sense of wait a minute, that's the first time writing was invented moment? And being there in front of the human presence and imagining your own hands fashioning that small piece of cuneiform or fashioning that Rosetta Stone or discovering that Rosetta Stone, that is something that is unique to being in front of a physical object. Our brains are uniquely fashioned to imagine both making things and creating things and discovering things. And that in particular is triggered by the physical artifact itself. So you can get access all you want online, but you're never going to get that type of an experience unless you are in front of the physical original. Does that answer your question?
Okay.
I'd like to give a different perspective on that, actually, if I could. Which is, I read a lot of Walter Benjamin when I was doing my PhD, and one of the things that they talked about with him is that the way he liked to think was to take an object and take an idea and turn it around and think about it in 360 degrees. And really, that notion, I think, is how the notion of aura that he talks about famously comes from. Actually, it comes about objects where the material truth of them and their meaning is visible from the things that you could see and the context in which you can see them. And I would challenge the idea that museums do hold the entire aura of the original, because always those objects that are in museums are abstracted from somewhere and some place where they came from before, which gives them part of, if we think that an aura is a thing, and I don't know if it's a thing or not, but if we think that an aura is a thing, the place where it comes from, the time when it comes from, museum doesn't hold those things in the object it holds in its collection. Those things are gone or they're somewhere else. Whether the Parthenon is in the British Museum or the Acropolis Museum, it isn't anymore on top of the Acropolis itself in 400 BC. And so something has always been lost in the very fact of putting things in places they didn't come from before. So if we thought that the aura was ever a very pure thing in the first place, I don't think it ever was. And what we're just seeing, again, to come back to my question of change, is a different change in the way that meaning is being given to the world. The second thing I'd say is that actually objects are very problematic, because sometimes there's things in them that you can't see that the naked eye itself or human perception will never see for itself. If we take a very famous example from the National Gallery, we have a great painting by Rembrandt that happens to have underneath it another great drawing he did before. No human being can see that because it's buried beneath layers and layers of oil paint, and we only discovered it through technology discovering something underneath the layer of those paint. How can we share that with the public except to use disintermediating, disembodying technology to show it to them? We can tell them in a label that it's there, but that gives no meaning back to that very artistic act of saying, well, look, I drew this thing today and then I thought it was rubbish and I decided to paint something else on top of it. And so there are always things in objects hidden beneath the surfaces and the visible meaning of them that we can also try to give up. And again, technology and digital media has an incredible role to play in that, because I simply objects are more complicated just than the things that you can see and experience themselves. That's not really to give a full answer to your question, but to say there's a more complex answer to it, I think, than is it digital or is it physical. It's that physical itself is a very complicated experience.
Okay, I want to leave you with a thought by William Sandberg that said many times that a good exhibition is a good dialogue between a curator and a visitor, as long as it's done perfectly. So I want to thank you all. I want to thank Einat. There you go. And thank you for listening.